Welcome to the Startup of the Year podcast, where each episode we showcase exciting new companies from around the world. This podcast is produced by Established, creators of the Startup of the Year program. Established is focused on helping organizations with their innovation, startup, and communication strategies.
All right, welcome to Startup of the Year podcast live. I'm Frank Gruber, the co-CEO and co-founder of Established and Established Ventures, and the team behind this podcast. I'm excited today because I've got Rachel Holt. She's a trailblazer investor and co-founder of Construct Capital, and she's actually got some great expertise in a lot of different areas: transportation, mobility, in all these different sectors that have been kind of things you wouldn't necessarily think of that are important, but they're super critical to like our continued innovation. And she got a lot of experience from working at Uber as an early Uber. And funny Uber story here real quick before I get her on here is that more or less Uber and Travis Kalanick and Garrett Camp connected with me a long time ago in DC before they had Uber, and got to see some of the early kind of stages of the app, and they tested it and showcased at some of our early TechCo events. And Ryan Graves used to come to our events, and he ended up becoming the first CEO. So a lot of early Uber stories. And then, and then they launched, and then they hired Rachel, and then they went off to the races. It was like the secret sauce. So excited to have her back to hear more about the story about, she was the first DC GM and really focused on the expansion. And so excited to talk to her about that, as well as what she's doing in the VC world today. So Rachel, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Excited.
All right. So for those unfamiliar with what you're doing, Construct Capital, can you share your mission and kind of like how you approach investing in transportation and the built world?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, thanks for having me on. These are always fun, and particularly with somebody who goes way back to understanding the origin story of Uber and the origins of certainly Uber in DC. But when I joined Uber in early 2011, everyone told me I was crazy to go join a taxi company. Their words, not mine, because transportation slow moving and heavily regulated and high capex, and you were never going to get a software or tech breakout in a space like transportation. I think a lot of that has stuck with me and stuck with. And kind of was a little bit of the driving force behind co-founding Construct with Dana Grayson, who is a longtime partner at NEA, had focused on the industrials area. I obviously knew the mobility area well, and started getting more into the supply chain and logistics side of the world as well. My last role at Uber was running all of the new mobility businesses, so the e-bikes, the e-scooters, and suddenly you would see the same challenges that we saw, early on in transportation and in supply chain and logistics in the manufacturing areas. And Dana and I got together and said, there's really a dearth of early stage investors that understand these spaces well. We think, we define it as foundational industries. We think of this as half the GDP that includes things like supply chain, logistics, mobility, that really have missed like the last 2 decades of technical and technological innovation, right? There was a lot of sort of the first wave of like computerization and robotics going into these spaces. And then, as a country, we like offshored everything for like the next 2 decades and focused on, wage comparative advantage and things like that. And so we missed all of this tech innovation. And simultaneously, you have all of these great tech founders who have brought cloud and mobile and AI and into kind of the rest of the economy, who are now saying, and we're now saying, like, let's turn our attention here, where you're talking about massive spaces, very little competition, huge revenue opportunities, and like no technology.
Right. And you guys took that on, and that's huge opportunity, right? Like, I think that's the thing you guys recognized. You partnered, obviously, to do this, and actually love to get the timing of this, because I thought it was interesting just checking out, especially as we've been investing for a while with Established as kind of SPVs, but as we transition into a more formalized organization institution, just want to get your how you did this. So more or less, You went to NEA, right? Because that's where Dana Grayson, your
Dana
partner.
was at NEA. I was just doing some scout work with them,
Mhm.
but we had known each other for a while. We saw that there was, just a lot of parallels in what she was seeing on manufacturing. She was seeing the industrial side. I was seeing it on the transportation side, was seeing it in the supply chain side.
Mhm.
And it was really that kind of like catalyzed and that was at the end of 2019,
Mhm.
right at the end of 2019 when we were kind of like, okay, let's actually jump in and do this. Certainly not exactly the timing we bargained for around, I think we literally, announced that we were doing this Jan 15th, give or take a day or so, which, we had kind of was an interesting timing for sure, with just what was to come, obviously, through the rest of 2020. Certainly an interesting time to raise a first fund as well. But I think in many ways, the attention that these spaces got through COVID, I think ended up being quite a tailwind for us and for the fund strategy, and just for great entrepreneurs seeing the opportunity as well in these spaces, because suddenly it wasn't just like something that they might have been thinking about, but suddenly everyone was wondering where their toilet paper and their napkins were.
Do you remember that? Like literally going to the grocery store and there's nothing on the shelves.
So it's like I try not to remember
That's
many
crazy.
of those days.
Yeah.
Also, an interesting time, we were trying to meet with LPs who were like,
Mhm.
I've never not met people in person or not done an on-site, on your, before investing in a first fund or in any fund, much less a first fund.
Mhm.
So there was
Oh yeah,
definitely,
that's a huge hurdle, right? Your first time
it was
investor.
definitely,
I mean, obviously having the scout kind of experience and having Dana obviously,
Dana had a real, an institutional track record, which made such a big difference for
right.
sure.
Yeah. Okay. It's
Um,
like that's that because you raised what, 140 million? That's a big.
140, yeah, we set out to raise 100, and ended up kind of raising our hard cap and closing 140 during that 2020
Wow.
year.
That's huge.
Um, Yeah, no, it ended up being it didn't, it felt like it was a tale of two halves, I'll say, because it was sort of crickets from March till really like June, and then kind of I think the world accepted that this is what the new normal was going to look like for a little bit, and so we really, the second half of the year, were able to kind of close the capital.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, so you kind of laid the groundwork then for your transition because you were scouting and that obviously helps shape the vision, and obviously being in mobility helps shape that vision. What industries within the transportation and mobility space are you most excited about? And have you been kind of watching ever since? It's been a few years now.
Yeah. No, it's a great question. I think probably some that I just have like too much scar tissue from, but also a bunch where you just see there's just still tremendous opportunity. I think, we're watching sort of the energy transition, and broadly, we sometimes refer to it as like the wake of electrification, really thinking about, okay, not just car electrification, by the way, home,
Right.
all of those areas of fundamentally, there's just a supply and demand mismatch right now around energy. And you
Hmm.
kind of solve that in two ways, right? You solve that by either somehow figuring out how to make either tamper demand or make that more efficient, or you increase supply. And I think you then couple what's going on right now with AI and just the compute needs that are happening, and that's only exacerbating this kind of energy crunch that we have in general. So I think we've got a couple of businesses really focused on sort of electrification broadly. We've got a super interesting company in Latin America that's building a battery swapping network for mopeds. And
Wow.
so, basically these kind of motorcycles are the predominant form factor, particularly for delivery drivers in LATAM. This company is headquartered in Brazil. There are 500,000 delivery drivers that ride mopeds every day in Sao Paulo alone. It's like
Wow.
bonkers to think about the scale.
Yeah.
And these guys are doing 120 kilometers a day on average. and there's no electric infrastructure whatsoever. And so by building a battery swapping cabinets, by building the battery swapping network, suddenly, it enables drivers to then rent these, electric mopeds, and saves them a tremendous amount of money on a weekly basis.
Yeah.
So we've got, looking at things like that. We've got an interesting company that's trying to build sort of like the repair center of the future, right? As cars go from being, really, or repair of cars have gone from being something you think of as like a mechanic with a hammer, to basically being software. And the vast majority of what you need to do to actually keep your car up is almost entirely software based. So it's called kinetic automation. They've got a robotic sensor recalibration center that enables vehicle sensors to basically be recalibrated in a couple of minutes, and this today takes a couple of hours at an auto body shop. And sensor proliferation is just like going to 10x over the next decade.
Wow,
Or
those are really
probably.
cool technologies. Curious now, you mentioned Latin America. So you're a global fund, right? Like you're not just focused on the US.
That is our one non US and Canada
Okay.
investment.
So we caught the one, the
Not
1%.
the one. And
Yeah.
I would say like it had to be square in our wheelhouse. Like
Right.
at Jump spent a lot of time on this like kiosk swapping network.
Mhm.
But if there's interesting things, happening in spaces we know well,
Mhm.
we're certainly, the aperture we're wide open on is geography. We like to enter at the seed or A, we're early stage. We're quite thesis focused in terms of the spaces we invest in, but when we see an interesting opportunity, and in the case of Vamo, like it made so much more sense for Brazil than
Yeah.
it makes sense for most other places. Like that business is nowhere near as interesting to invest in the US as it is to invest in down there, just because of the moped density.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a really good opportunity for that time and place. You're in the right time, right place, right time to find that company, and obviously a huge problem that you've identified that not a lot of people are probably thinking about. So, you mentioned a couple of these already. I think you might be reading my notes to read my mind here. What key qualities, do you look for then when you're looking for these startups? Obviously, you mentioned a couple already, just right opportunity, right time. But as you look at founders, what kind of helps you decide on these early stage companies?
Yeah, I mean, when you're thinking about sort of something at that earliest stage, it's probably 80% founder, 20% market, right? And as you move from the seed to A to B to C, it starts flip-flopping, right? If you're a series C or D, D investor, you're investing like 80% on the traction that the company has and 20% on the founder or CEO. It's totally flipped at the early stages. So I think for us, really making sure you've got that a founder that's like thinking big. I mean, Uber would not be anywhere near what it is today if you didn't have a founder, or founders, co-founders like Travis and Garrett. And you really need, at every turn, Travis was pushing himself, us, as a team to be like, how do we do this faster? How do we do this bigger?
Yeah.
And, was sort of like one of a kind in being able to find like, make an inch a mile, right? In terms of opportunity. And I think just having, different founders have different styles of doing it, but really that founder that is able to think big, that's able to envision kind of what the future can look like. But you also then need to couple that with somebody who gets a product out on time, drives a team to excellence. And so it's really that like duality of being able to think big. That's what recruits the team. That's what helps raise the money.
Mhm.
That's what kind of excites the world about what you're building. But you got to couple that. There are a lot of people who do that who then can't couple that with getting a product out on time, on a day-to-day basis, like that is perfect. And so the best founders can do both. And I think they're hard to find, people that can do both. But when you found, when you see them, you kind of just know it, as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And for those just joining here with Rachel Holt from Construct Capital, we're talking about, well, a little bit lately about our VC firm, but a little bit about Uber there with Travis Kalanick. So to touch on that a little bit more, Travis obviously gets a lot of heat for, I mean, there's a whole new TV show. Are you in the TV show, by the way? I got to rewatch.
No,
Oh, okay.
no,
Thankfully, no. Yeah.
thankfully, no.
Yeah. Okay. So, for all the negative, obviously there's a lot of positive too. Can you talk a little bit about the positive? I don't want to
I
dominate.
mean, yeah, I mean, I think like, whether it's I mean, the TV show was all sensationalized anyway,
Right.
and there were makeup characters and stuff
Oh,
like that.
fun fact. My co-founder Jen's laptop is in the TV show. Like the back of it with all of her stickers. They copied her laptop because he spoke at some of our events early, and
Oh, that's hilarious.
they literally
Yeah.
took the screen. So it has
There's some picture or
it has
something.
Tech Cocktail on there. It has DC Week. It has like all these brands. There's a Kenny Bunkport brand that they have on there. Day Trip Society. That's how we knew. We're like, and an AOL logo. Like that's
Yeah,
awesome, man. Yeah. So I'm like, that's
you guys. Yeah,
it's ridiculous.
that's hilarious.
It's pretty funny.
And so yeah, many things.
That's the one thing that was factual, but it was
Yeah,
wrong
exactly. We
person.
got one factual thing, the made up characters, notwithstanding.
Yeah.
But and I think like all these books,
Mhm.
they tell 2% of the story,
Right.
right?
Right.
And whether that 2% is true or not is a whole different question, but they're not telling the full story. And I think, what made Uber so special was it was just a very high quality team that was assembled, that was, all the deep passion, I think, that
Mhm.
we all had for the problem that we were solving was a combination um, of really, and I'll also add, it was a very decentralized organization, right? So I was, my very first role there was running DC, and the job description was like CEO of your city, right?
Right.
And we had this amazing ability to move quickly because we were all there was this sense of like we were startups within a bigger startup.
Mhm.
And yet sharing all the info, I'd figure something out in DC, and my friend Josh in New York would be the first one I'd ping it to. He'd figure something out in New York, and it was how quickly can you spread that around the world. And I think that created both tremendous speed, tremendous ability, and transportation is quite local, right? The ability to customize something that worked for your city, but it also meant that that there was less control over every single thing that was going on, right?
Right.
And so that means that one person does one foolish thing in one tiny country, and suddenly that becomes the impression that people have of what Uber is like or stands for, even if that it may have actually been way far away from what was going on in your city. I mean, you knew some of the early Uber folks, folks like Alex that we had in DC.
Alex Priest. Yeah.
Incredibly, yeah, amazingly hardworking,
Mhm.
incredibly just focused and dedicated to trying to build, something special in DC. And then as we expanded, my role expanded from the very beginning, just running DC. And then they were like, Ryan actually called me on my honeymoon and was like, hey, can you like take on Atlanta too? And I was like, okay. And then it was like, hey, can you take on Baltimore and Philly and Boston and then New York?
Wow.
And suddenly it was the East Coast, and then same kind of thing happened. East Coast, hey, can you help take on the West Coast? And then it became US and Canada business.
Just take on the whole thing. Right. Okay.
Well, exactly. Fortunately, we had a lot of other smart folks
Yeah.
taking a lot of other places in the world. But we just had this sort of very organic ability to grow and expand, and then and really this like experimentation culture of when you figured something out in one place and immediately that became the blueprint the next day for what for the new way to onboard drivers, or the best marketing email, or the best drip campaigns. Like, we were not bottlenecking things with a lot of central, innovation.
Right.
And then over
Interesting
time, of
strategy,
course,
right?
we decentralize.
Yeah, it's
It's
a really
exactly.
interesting strategy because then everyone's doing their own thing, testing it out and figuring out what works, and then collectively coming back with what the best practice might be.
That's exactly right. And we had a small team called the Pro Team that would help kind of disseminate those best practices. It really it create, every people say, like, what's the best, like, org structure? It's like, there's no one best org structure, right? What matters is you've got a strategy, and then you create a structure to align with that. And ours was very much about effective growth, right? And about smartly trying to say, how can we continue to expand in the most, in an efficient way? How can we experiment quickly? How can we learn quickly? Because no one had ever done, there wasn't a playbook of
Right.
another company that we were using.
Yeah.
Now there are a lot of companies that have, like, the decentralized GM model, and they're like, oh, we'll find a GM or a ops manager from another company and take them on. There wasn't a playbook
Mhm.
um, when Uber started. And I think, obviously, Ryan, Travis, everyone kind of empowering folks with, like, let the best idea win, was truly an Uber value. And it didn't matter where you sat or what country you were in, or, that idea would become standard fare
Mhm.
if it worked.
That's really interesting. Obviously, something a lot of startup founders could take from this conversation, and probably investors too, right? As they look at companies. So, as you approach new companies, and again, for those just joining, Rachel Holt from Construct Capital here. She's out of DC. She's an early Uber, under 30, right? Under 30th employee,
Right about there, yeah.
right? And I'm talking about kind of the growth there, but now she's doing venture capital work, and focusing on finding really great companies in transportation, mobility, supply chain, and the built world. So these are obviously ongoing rapid challenges and changes that we're seeing. So what are some of those most pressing challenges or industries that you see and, like, you're most excited about, and are they applying some of these things that you're mentioning to kind of their work?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we're seeing, as an example, when we were doing the e-bike and e-scooter. So Uber acquired a company called Jump, and
Yeah.
then I came in to help oversee those businesses. And we would literally have the bikes would come or be assembled in China, right? They would go on a boat. We would have no clue when they were going to hit the US. We would, like, have, proof of life of the bikes, that they were somewhere in Long Beach. They would then have to go through customs, and because of the battery components, it was a little bit of a longer customs process than, a t-shirt coming through customs. And then they would, hit our Sacramento sort of final assembly facility, and then they'd go out to the city that they were going to be launched in. And we would, like, lose them all the time, right? Not actually lose them, but you'd have no visibility as
Mhm.
to where they were coming. So here we are, with Uber as an example, knowing exactly, being able to track by the second, what your driver coming to pick you up. And yet, you know, tens of millions of dollars of bikes, like, you'd have no clue when they would arrive. And you'd have to staff up the warehouse for, like, days, just in the anticipation that the bikes might come, and they
Just in
need to
case
be
it's that day, they come that day. You just gotta be
that day.
ready.
And then you have, like, the Chicago mayor being like, we need them launched by, like, Tuesday. Where are they? And you're like, I don't
Uh,
know.
yeah,
So there were just so many parallels and I'm just using supply chain visibility, which is, like, one really small
yeah.
piece
Oh,
of the whole
it's
supply
weird. It's
chain
their ugly
challenge.
head, right? Around COVID times, right? We didn't know where our toilet paper was. We didn't know where
Totally. And,
our
and you
food
know,
was.
it's funny because when we were talking, particularly when we were talking to LPs, like, in that 4-week period or so in February or end of January, February, before COVID, in 2020, they were like, are these really challenges? Like, I've not really ever seen challenges. And you're like, I'm telling you, like, we have this is a big problem. And then we have those same people kind of 6 months later being like, hey, you said you guys had a really good point there. Like, let's revisit that, right? Because if you don't see it sometimes with these spaces, it's hard to it's hard to kind of understand. But
I think they see it now.
now people see it, and that's just supply chain. In manufacturing, there's huge opportunity. We haven't even, because we haven't, we've been sending so much of our manufacturing overseas, we've literally lost the ability to build certain things in the US. And so we used to need, as an example, like a ton of I'll give you an example of one of the businesses we're invested in is called Hadrian. Super interesting company. They're building basically an automated factory for space and defense parts. And the CNC machinists that used to build these parts, the average age of a machinist in the US is 65. Like literally the machinists are dying and retiring in the US, and their kids are not becoming
light.
Ron?
Light. Keep moving.
Yeah, exactly. Keep moving. I gotta get my arms going.
Yep.
But machinists, we don't have enough machinists in the US. And so what Hadrian is doing is building just a far more efficient factory, and it's really using their software. It's a software-defined manufacturing process. And so, what that means, and we're really good as a country at building software.
Yeah.
Like, we are not as good at putting a lot of people in an assembly line and trying to build stuff. And so I think the amazing opportunity we have right now, and kind of we think of this as like a once in a generation opportunity, because you can now implement like literally 25 years of software in some of these spaces. And in many cases, I think leapfrog what historically, leapfrog some of the steps, because we now have Gen AI, we now have, sort of much more sophisticated ways of collecting data. It's not about putting it in a big, putting it in a big system. It's actually now you can collect the data through, through just kind of scraping everyone's, WeChat logs and invoices, and suddenly, we have programs that can actually do the data inputs, and then you can make much smarter decisions once you have that data. But we can literally skip the really painful data entry pieces, and we're seeing that across manufacturing. We've got a cool company called Ditero, which is bringing AI into the procurement space. Anyway, I think a number of these opportunities are just kind of poised to become really large companies.
Yeah, definitely. And you mentioned software, and I got a question in actually from one of our live audience members. They said, what are you doing about information software sharing? For example, like companies like John Deere will now share this with their customers or non-John Deere repair facilities. I guess, do you see any of that kind of work where there's cross-pollination?
We don't. I mean, I think we don't see that as much, I think, just in terms of our spaces. I do think data security is really important. We've got a company called Copia Automation, which is helping to build sort of all of the underlying developer operations tools in industrial space, in the industrial area, and literally software in the industrial area when you needed to update PLCs, which are like the computers that control machines. You used to have to walk the code across on a USB stick. It was literally called air gapping, because it was you were so those areas have just huge, I think, security breach opportunity
potential.
Yeah, exactly. Because
USB didn't make it for some reason. We don't know where it is.
USB didn't make it. Who knows? But it's definitely a really I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I think, making sure, but obviously it's really important that particularly these B2B companies are just very transparent about where the data goes.
Right.
For sure.
All right. That's great. Thanks for asking that question in the chat there. I'm
Yeah.
here with Rachel Holt, Construct Capital, for those just joining. It's a VC firm focused on transportation, mobility, supply chain, and the built world. We're going to keep going along that same thread around innovation. Some of the things you are seeing, and I guess I should ask, is there like a division of who looks at what kinds of companies, just so I know, like does Dana look at different companies, you look at different companies, you all look at the
I
same one?
mean, we do. We're super collaborative. I mean, I think we're a small team. There are
Right.
9 of us total. 4 on the investing side, in addition to Dana and I. And we definitely have the belief, and we've founded the firm with the belief that like a team approach is better than an individual one. Like some people think of VC as an individual sport, like we do not. If we're going to compete with firms that are 5 times our size, in terms of their team or their AUM, we're going to compete because like we're bringing the whole team to bear.
Right.
That said, like Dana has spent more time in the industrials area, more time in the manufacturing area. I've spent more time certainly on the transportation mobility area, but like we're very collaborative in
Yeah, I see some
general.
firms like say, okay, you're focused on just finding
Totally,
fintech and you're just focused on AI or whatever. So just wanted to make sure that I want to see how you guys are doing it.
totally.
Okay.
It is, yeah, it's definitely it's a team approach for sure.
Good. Okay.
I think one of the things I think that we see ourselves as a little bit differentiated is like, we don't have half a partner or one partner focused on this, like the whole firm is focused on this.
Right.
And so, our focus isn't going to change next week. Which I think, unfortunately, we sometimes do see in venture where a firm or a partner gets excited about one thing and then kind of pivots
Mhm.
this opportunity.
Which is tough because you've sold this out to LPs that you're going to do XYZ and now you're going to do ABC.
And to founders,
Right.
and to
Yeah.
founders, right? So like that's where I think it's even harder
Mhm.
is founders who um you know kind of are in favor one week and out of favor the next is just a
They're
really
not
tough.
jumping into crypto this week, is what
We're
you're
not exactly. We weren't a crypto fund a year ago, a defense fund, and now we're back to an AI fund, and then back to a
Right.
crypto
Right.
fund.
Good. Okay. So you're not going to be dealing with Giphies and all that kind of stuff, JPEG.
Exactly.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Good. All right. So let's move along the same lines here with some of the things you're looking at then. Urban transportation, obviously something you're very familiar with in your background. What are some of the, I guess, things around logistics and urban transportation that you're seeing, and not even sustainable transportation that you're seeing that you think will kind of drive the next innovation wave in that area?
Yeah. I mean, we've got a company where we're really, I mean, look, I think first and foremost, like tech needs to permeate these spaces,
Yeah.
right? You need to have tech rail, like just like what Uber to taxis, right? You
Mhm.
need those next iterations of tech forward companies that are, that are basically gonna create the foundation of what the next generation companies are. I'll give you, another example of a company in our portfolio that's doing quite well is called Viho.
Mhm.
They do package delivery.
Mhm.
They're a package delivery company, so they partner with brands like Lululemon or Sephora, big brands who care about the customer experience,
Mhm.
not just that they can impart, but basically the customer experience from the moment to the moment that a customer actually receives their package. And so Viho, because fundamentally the whole business is based on technology, you get a text message, so you know exactly when the package arrives. You can actually communicate with the driver on an ongoing basis to
Mhm.
say, hey, can you deliver it like around the flower patch, so no one can see it on the street.
Right.
And fundamentally, because of the tech, the on-time arrival that the packages have is just far better than the
Mhm.
incumbent.
Where's that company
Um,
based? I'm curious more about that company.
they split between New York and Austin,
Okay. Yeah.
in terms of where it's based. So they've got obviously there's obviously a lot of the brands that are New York based.
Yeah.
But the business, DC is a place where where they do quite a lot of deliveries, and it is I will now get packages delivered from Viho. It reminds me a lot of like the first time I heard somebody else talk about Uber,
Hmm.
and I was, oh, like this is actually I'm actually starting to see this in the wild. And the first time like somebody next to me was requesting an Uber,
Hmm.
um,
That's
which
fun.
again now seems ridiculous, right? To think
Right.
about.
Oh yeah.
Like I remember those moments because those are the moments where it's like, hey, maybe we're onto something.
Mhm.
And we're seeing the exact same thing with Viho. Now it's scaling quite quickly. They're able to use gig drivers similar to the Uber model to actually do the delivery from the warehouse to the customer. And that means they can adjust based on the day of the week, supply and demand on the day of the week. That means they can adjust and realize that, the next 3 weeks of delivery doesn't look at all like what January looks like.
Right.
And so many of these systems for us as a country were built at a time when, like, whether it's packages or manufacturing or any of these things, like a set number of packages or set number of widgets were produced at a set rate and they were delivered on a set schedule.
Hmm.
That's not at all how these systems are built. And they're not, they haven't been flexible. We have a huge labor gap in the US when it comes to these to manufacturing jobs, industrial jobs in general. And so I think, we've very much seen that it's no longer like these innovations are no longer nice to have. It's now become a real need to have.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I'm curious, are you seeing that like with some of the companies you're connecting with or investing in, are they stressed about the lack of labor or the lower amount of labor in the US?
It's interesting. I feel like definitely some of the customers are.
Yeah.
We're hearing that from customers of some of our companies. We've got a few companies that are really trying to we would call it worker augmentation, like help augment the workforce.
Mhm.
Sometimes that means like a robotic augmentation, right?
I thought you
That
were going to talk about robots. I'm excited about talking about robots. Let's talk about robots now. This is
Totally. We
smart.
love like when
Yeah.
you got to get robots and people
Mhm.
working together.
Mhm.
Another company in our portfolio called Chef Robotics.
Mm.
They help with food assembly. So think about like not necessarily in the back of a restaurant, but think
Right.
about, true food assembly and manufacturing. You literally
Oh, okay.
cannot find people. First of all, these jobs are generally tough, right? You're working sometimes in a freezer, you're
Oh, wow.
scooping
Hmm.
8 hours a day, huge injuries.
Hmm.
The
But the
reasons
robots don't care.
the robots do not care.
Yeah.
But it's, and the cool thing here is they're actually using like AI to now to be able to literally a human can do a job and then the robot can actually learn through mimicking it,
That's crazy.
and then do it
Yeah.
on their own.
Yeah.
But I think this kind of like this isn't like this scary robots are coming. It's like thank
Mhm.
God we need the
We can
robots
scoop ice
because
cream.
we literally can't otherwise.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not about the ice cream shop. It's about the person in the
Yeah.
back of a manufacturing
Right.
company that
Putting it into the,
exactly and scoop
yeah.
rice all
Yeah.
day.
Yeah. Right.
Is they're assembling, some sort of prepackaged meal. And these jobs are critical. And it's not about wages going up. Wages have gone up in these jobs and people don't want them. And so you
Hmm.
either need to make the jobs more appealing, you need
Right.
to figure out how to augment, and that we think of like the last 10 feet is
Yeah.
almost impossible to make robotic. And
Right.
so how do you how do
It's the
you
middle
kind of
part.
help
Yeah.
how do you help support that last, either help support that last 10 feet, and then how do you think about sort of other businesses that, I think like what Uber did, that can make these jobs more flexible, that can
Mhm.
make them available to a wider set of constituents. The kind of unknown part of Uber
Mhm.
is that I think one of the biggest pieces of innovation in Uber was the ability for insurance to not be a 24/7, 365-day a year at a really high, assuming that you're doing commercial work
Mhm.
for 365 days a year. Even the vast majority of taxi drivers, right? There was a large portion of their time where they weren't transporting passengers, and yet the insurance was as high as it was because the assumption is we can't tell when commercial activity is happening and when commercial activity isn't happening. Therefore, we need to assume commercial activity is always happening.
Yeah.
Right. And so, one of the amazing things about UberX in particular was that it enabled people to get into this job in a more, casual way, to do 10, 15, 20 hours a week. And actually a lot of the innovation that enabled that was within the insurance space, because suddenly you could use your car for 50 hours a week for personal reasons. Or 100 of the vast majority, whether you're using the car or not, the vast majority of your hours a week were for personal reasons, and the 10 or 15 or 20 hours you're actually using it for commercial reasons were when the higher insurance would kick in.
Interesting. Obviously a huge logistics company too, right? Like some of the things you learned probably from the overall logistics of that, even though it looks like a forward-facing rideshare, right? There's just so many lessons I'm sure you've learned from logistics. So what are
and just how to scale a company, and
let's talk about that. That's a great intro or lead in. And we got some folks just joining too that kind of jumped in at the end here. But Rachel Holt from Construct Capital, we're talking about her role in investing in some of the most interesting new companies in certain spaces here, the transportation, mobility, built world. So let's talk about scaling. Some of the lessons you've learned from scaling Uber, and then just as you see founders, what are those lessons that you maybe might want to share, or with some of those founders, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the key things is is just hiring, right? And I think one of the amazing resources of kind of that ex-Uber community is just the quality of the people. Who we had the innovative nature of those team members. But I think I think a lot of it is how do you think about growing and effectively growing and building your team? When do you need to add? When sometimes it's too early. Like we see a lot of, particularly on the sales side, like a lot of founders make the mistake of adding a salesperson before they actually really have. It's not that they didn't have product market fit, but they didn't have go-to-market fit down, right? They didn't have the whole sales playbook down, and there's nothing that can substitute from a founder doing sales.
No.
Even if you have an amazing, early salesperson, but when you start scaling that sales team before you kind of have that sales to product kind of jive.
Yeah, that's because the founder can make the call, right? Like the founders can make the call, like, "Hey, we're going to pivot and do this," even though
I've heard this 5 times. We need to make that change, and how they know what's coming down the pipe on the product. They know how to get ahead of selling, and I think when you try to scale before there's a playbook, I think that's tough. Like Uber actually spent almost almost a year iterating on the business model in San Francisco. It was just done before they even went to New York, right? And then it was like 5 months in New York before they went to Seattle. And then it was like 2 months in Seattle before they went to Chicago. And then it was like a month. And then they had we started to get this playbook, right? And then it became, 2 weeks to the next city, and then a week to the next city, and then a day to the next city, right? Because at that point, sort of the early playbook was set. And so, there's a set of people on the team you want to invent the playbook. There's a set you want to scale the playbook, and there's a set you want to optimize the playbook. And it's super hard to find people on the team that are great at all 3 phases. And so you really need to understand, what is this person's superpower, and how does that person's superpower fit with what I need? And I think, that's a big piece of the pie. And then I think the other thing that Travis did as well as anyone else I've seen is, and I think Elon's certainly done this at Tesla, is not being afraid to cannibalize yourself,
Mhm.
Like and I think right now it's like so important, right? When you think about these SaaS companies where like AI is coming,
Mhm.
for quite a lot of these SaaS companies,
Any
and
company, it's coming. I mean,
every
yeah,
company, and like,
yeah,
you've got to be willing
yeah.
to, when we, when we started to realize at Uber that like price was such an important lever in the business,
Mhm.
Uber Black was a much higher price product.
Mhm.
Then we were like, let's, and started, Uber X. And then you got to realize that if you don't cannibalize yourself, someone else is going to.
Mhm.
And I think it's easy, particularly in the Uber story, to see like, of course, Uber X was going to be the answer, but that it didn't feel like that in
Didn't
many
start
cases.
that way. No, it was very much
No,
a
it was all
black
black car.
supreme kind of or superior service for everybody. That's
And the original tagline, the original mission was like everyone's private ride.
private ride. Yeah.
It
Yep.
was that concept of mimicking the limo and the private driver experience in a
Reminded me.
universal way.
It reminded me because we so at South by Southwest, I think it was 2010, Travis
Yep.
had the test beta app and he and Ryan slept at our house that we rented for South by. And so we had a black car service driving us around. It was basically Uber before Uber existed, driving us around Texas as a test before it kind of even launched, which is kind of crazy. When you mentioned the black car thing, it reminded me of that story. I was like, oh my God, that's
Well,
crazy.
I remember in the very earliest Uber days,
Yeah.
I just moved to DC. I was on the West Coast, just moved to DC,
Mhm.
and 10 days later, we did our first rides. Um, really, really quick, trying to kind of get the product going as quickly as possible.
Mhm.
And it really felt like that for a while. Because
Where were
like
you before?
I was in the West Coast, so I
Oh,
moved to
okay.
DC in
Got it.
2011. I was in the Bay
Yeah.
Area,
Yep.
and so moved, and it's funny. I grew up in New York City, and so
Mhm.
like the transportation dearth that
Mhm.
was San Francisco and DC compared to New York was,
Yeah.
I was like, I better get this thing up and running because otherwise I'm not like this subway system is inadequate compared to New York.
Mhm.
And but it was very funny because our neighbors who we subsequently became very close with, was like we didn't know if you were like a drug dealer or an ambassador,
Mhm.
because it's like DC, but there was just a steady stream of black cars that would come
Mm.
down our block.
Right.
And we were like, the thing we didn't have at the time on our bingo board was like you ran Uber.
Right.
But we were like, we knew it was something strange.
That's so fun.
That's what it felt like at the beginning, right? And
Yeah.
we were trying to ride a lot at the very beginning because otherwise, like, we were the demand,
Mhm.
right? We were the first customers.
Right. Yeah, it's really fun. Fun stories, obviously, and obviously love hearing how you've kind of applied it now to companies you're seeing. We're almost out of time here, and so I want to be conscious of that for you and obviously our listeners too. But I guess we'll switch gears here. And for those just joining, we're with Rachel Holt from Construct Capital. She's investing in built world mobility. What else? Mobility, transportation,
Mobility, supply chain,
logistics. Yeah,
safety,
yeah,
manufacturing,
manufacturing.
the boring half of the GDP, but like the
But
really,
have become critical technologies. I mean, those are all
really
critical
are.
technologies, right? And even the White House put out a list of critical technologies last year, and you're on that list with pretty much everything you're doing. So important for America, and obviously making us a stronger, more resilient country. So obviously important work you're doing. So let's talk about advice for founders. You've given a lot, but I want to kind of wrap it up with those that are founders, I guess, that are listening, and I guess some investors that are listening too, I guess. So first off, founders that are navigating this, raising capital. You've done it in a very tough time for your own capital raise for this fund, doing it during COVID. Can you kind of maybe give some advice for anybody that's doing that, especially in the transportation and built world space? Like,
Yeah, I mean, I think fundamentally, like, there is a lot of capital out there. It's about finding the right partner that understands what you're doing, and why it is so important. And so I think one of the most challenging things that, as a founder, is really navigating kind of, um, through not just all of the firms you've heard of or know about, but like who is the right individual partner,
mhm,
in many cases that kind of gets what I'm doing. Um, So I would say, like, first and foremost, like, founders are doing, it's so hard what founders do. I mean, what we do is, nothing compared to what founders do. And I think, having been on the operating side for so long and not even in that founder seat, like, I have so much respect, for what founders, are going through. But I think first and foremost, like, you know, take the time to find the right partner that gets what you're doing, I think is really important. Um, Honestly, sometimes think about whether venture is the right capital path. Like, there are a whole bunch of businesses we see that I'm like, these are great businesses, they're super interesting businesses.
Hmm.
But you have to remember, like, venture is trying to find the, you know, multi hundreds of millions of dollars to $1 billion plus exits.
Right.
And if a company really is on that ultimate path, I think, it's going to be tough, to kind of go out to venture. So I think, thinking broadly about what is the right way to fund, what is the right way to fund the business, I think it's super important. And then I think, like, continue to think big. Like, the best founders are ones that, like, can't help themselves, from thinking big,
Mhm.
and can't help themselves from, like, thinking about what is the next opportunity, what is the next opportunity. Keep doing that, but, like, don't lose sight of, like, what you need to do today,
Mhm.
to make it work. Sometimes we'll see founders that, like, have amazing vision, but, like, can't send a follow-up. And it's so frustrating because you're like, I want to see this come to life so much.
Right.
Um, but how do you really make sure to balance what you're great at, the team, what the team is good at, and kind of complement yourself in the right way,
Mhm.
um, to kind of be able to achieve what you're hoping to.
Those are great points. And the one that I wanted to circle back on is the point about being a venture backable business. And even talking about you've raised your first fund, it was 140. I think your second one was like 300 million.
Yeah,
So now
that's
you've
what
got
I
440 million. I'm not a math major, but that's
read.
about what it is, right? And 340 million that you've got to work with. How do you, for you to get return on that, what do you need? Like, I mean, just what do you need to find? And I think
I mean,
that's
I think where venture ends, what the reality is that it's usually a couple of companies that
right,
drive the success of the fund.
right.
And for us, we if we don't feel like there is a path to an investment returning the fund,
Hmm.
like an individual investment returning the fund, it's really hard to make that
Yeah,
investment.
right.
And so, when we do think about why ownership is important, when we think about,
Mhm.
getting to that 10-15% plus ownership threshold, it's not to, like, be greedy or be annoying. But part of it is just like a time allocation. Like, we have a concentrated portfolio, 20 to 25 companies total, in any fund. Definitely not spray and pray, because, like, we want to be able to spend time with those founders. And as a result, that works when we have the ownership, in a business to, allocate that time.
Yeah,
And that doesn't rolling ownership, that doesn't mean anything like that, but it does mean
yeah.
sort of clearing that 10% hurdle
Hmm.
consistently.
Yeah, that makes sense. Oh, great. I think it's helpful. And then I guess we're almost at time here. There's a couple questions from the audience I was going to jump into. Let me just see if there's want to leave time for kind of last thoughts. But all right. So if you were to if you had the resources to launch a startup tomorrow, this is from the audience, in the transportation or built environment sectors, what unexpected problem would you aim to solve and that no one's currently addressing? Ooh, I don't know if you want to answer that. Or maybe you
That's
do.
a good one.
Yeah.
Maybe not. No, I mean, it's funny. It's like, first of all, I think, look at what your experience, like, where do you as a founder have, like, an unfair advantage? I
Hmm.
think is something. So I can share, and, we've looked at, and there's some random spaces, like the space that is doing, auto hauling,
Hmm.
right? Like, have you ever thought about, like, how a car gets to a car dealership or around? Like, no.
Oh.
Very interesting opportunity, very interesting space, like, very long tail,
Hmm.
super, super nascent and underdeveloped compared to so many other areas of trucking. So like you'll find these like random ones, but I think, I do think the best founders, like it comes out of like a deep passion and like, again, an unfair advantage in terms of being able to either understand a space so well or being able to apply to like understand the technology so well that you can apply it. And so I would say like, let the spaces and what you're excited about like develop out of your natural curiosity, because you're going to have to spend like 10 years thinking about this problem.
Yeah.
So I think it's like super important. It's not like my problem, it's your problem, and I don't mean that as like it's your problem to figure out. It's like it's the problem that like you can't help but think about every day. I mean, that's where
really
I
gotta
think,
love that getting those cars to those dealerships. Or
yeah, exactly. If you love that, like if you're,
yeah.
your dad runs a car dealership, no, but like it's not even that. It's just, or if you like so understand this like technology and you spent the last decade thinking about mobile and cloud in in the tech world, and now you're able to do that in the built world. Like love those business, love those people. I love, we very much end up investing in the people who have seen an analogous problem in a space and are like, I can now apply it here, right? You don't need to be the engineer out of Ford looking to disrupt Ford. Like that's less of what we end up investing in, but we love the tech entrepreneur who has seen and solved a problem in the technology world and is now saying, hey, we got that same problem in in the built world and I can solve it.
Really, 100% agree with you there. And I think that is a good one you mentioned too, because I was thinking about have you ever had to move a car? Like it's always feels like it's like the toughest place to kind of find somebody to do something and feel like they can actually do it. So anyway, really good points. Thank you, Rachel Holt, so much for joining us today. Really fascinating discussion. Love what you're doing at Construct Capital, and obviously continue to drive innovation on these critical technology areas. They're so pivotal to like the United States overall. Becoming really resilient, obviously, for everything else we're doing. And with that one company that's doing the thing in Latin America too, obviously. Right, exactly. And for those listening, thanks so much for listening. Really appreciate you being here today. And if you do have a startup idea, it's probably something that you've been thinking about for a while. Get it going, get it iterating. Obviously get it out there, and you're going to learn a lot from that exposure and ability and just that experience overall. So obviously, if you're interested in help, come to Startup of the Year. We can try to help you along the way, and with access to network development, resources, exposure, and sometimes really great stories here from folks like Rachel that can help you along. So thanks so much, Rachel. Really appreciate you being here today. Thank you so much. Until next time, I'm Frank Gruber signing off from Startup of the Year podcast. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you all again soon.
Thanks for listening to the Startup of the Year podcast. Be sure to subscribe, and we'll be back with another episode soon.